World Class, which is in part, it's almost a memoir of Andreas, although he's too young to write a memoir yet, but in which he talks about how he began his career as a scientist who basically stumbled upon a class of Neville Postlewhite, who was really one of the founders of the field of comparative education and of cross-national studies. And he worked with him, worked initially for the IEA, and then ends up at the OECD at a time when no one is measuring anything, and these ministers get together to tell each other how wonderful things are in their countries. And Andreas and someone who worked with him said, well, why don't we actually bring some truth to these conversations? Maybe that'll change the nature. And they began PISA. And of course, to all of you, you kind of take PISA for granted, but I remember the world before PISA and after PISA. And it did change the conversation. I remember when the first report was published, nobody really knew what this was. You know, we wondered, is this something that you eat that has tomato and cheese on it, or what is it? But it's amazing how in only 2 decades, and it didn't take 2 decades for this to be a game changer, that basically said, look, information is like the sunlight. It's like disinfectant. It changes the nature of the conversation. There is no place to hide, and it's very powerful. But what is important to me is that, to highlight, is that Andreas is a learner. And so in a way, PISA are his experiments with truth. You know, he will do this thing and then pay attention and then change it and do other things differently. And if you have followed PISA, there is an associated project, Education 2030, which is really about getting everybody to broaden their understanding about what does it mean to educate a person, a good person, who can be a contributor to their societies. And I want to recognize Andreas because I forget now, in March, I think it was, when we saw this pandemic coming, I had great anxiety about what this was going to do to the world. And I reached out to a few friends in various agencies and says, what do we do? And I reached out to Andreas, and within 30 minutes, we talked and said, well, let's do something. It doesn't have to be perfect. We don't have the resources. We don't plan on that, but let's begin to do something. And we did a couple of surveys and we did some case studies, and it's been a real joy to collaborate with him. I've gotten to know more about him as a person and as a leader as part of that process. And I appreciate that whenever I've called on him to do things like this, he always says yes. I don't know why he keeps this bright disposition on life. And so I'm very grateful, Andreas, that you took time on a Saturday to be with us. And so without further ado, over to you. Please join me in welcoming Andreas.
Thanks so much, Fernando. And what a pleasure to join this amazing conference. It's a great setup on a very, very kind of important theme. Obviously, these are difficult times for all of us. I think that's something that I don't need to tell you, the deep impact that the pandemic has left on individuals, on institutions, on education systems overall. And whatever we do, we're going to see very long shadows on our future societies and our future economies. The economists Hanushek and Westman have tried to estimate what the learning losses that have occurred up to now could mean for our future economies. And the numbers they come up are simply staggering. I think, when you think about, 14 trillion US dollars being lost over the life cycle of the Corona generation, it tells you simply that the cost of improvement of education is such a tiny fraction of what we miss if we don't get this right. What this also shows is that just getting back to the status quo of education is not going to do justice to the needs of tomorrow's learners. And I think we should keep this in mind, that this is not, just a little episode that's going to go away, but it's going to have long-lasting consequences that we need to address. And it's easy to say, very hard to do. When you think about how education has evolved, Fernando mentioned PISA. We started this in the year 2000. The world was very different in that time. When you think about reading literacy, it was about extracting knowledge from prefabricated texts. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia and you could trust that answer to be true. But then things started to change. Technology started to kick in. You can see how it evolved. When we did our third PISA test in 2006, that was the year before the iPhone was invented. Now, Twitter was still a sound, but what you can actually see, look at the red line, that quality of learning outcomes in our education systems has only marginally changed. And then 2009, social media once again fundamentally changed in which we interact, in the ways in which we interact with information. And once again, you do not see that translating into different outcomes. And then, 2012, robotics, cloud computing, biogenetics. Now, 2015, the emergence of artificial intelligence. Now, huge changes in our societies and very little impact on the way in which we teach and the way in which we learn. That is sort of the backdrop that we need to have in mind when we want to do things differently. It is not easy. The status quo in education has an incredible number of protectors, and they come from all sides. Just want to leave you with one number. Basically, when we looked at the share of young people who could reliably distinguish between fact and opinion, it was just 1 in 10 on average in the wealthiest countries in the world. I talk about the OECD countries now. You can say, well, it's a little bit better than it was, in the year 2000, it was about 7%. But again, we live in a totally different world. Today, it's the essence of literacy skills. Now, literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge, validating knowledge. And young people are not prepared for this. Well, fortunately, it doesn't look everywhere like this. You have, some regions in China that have, continued to see progress. Singapore moving from good to great. You can see Estonia, a relatively poor country in Europe, changing its education system every few years. A country like Portugal or Poland also seeing quite significant progress. Even at the lower end of the scale, look at Peru, you look at Albania. Steady progress. Countries like Brazil or Turkey, you might not think are so impressive in the improvement, but think about what they achieved. The example of Turkey, in 2003, they had only 1/3 of students enrolled at age 15. In 2018, it was 73%, and outcomes had improved. So this idea that, you get more people in the system and it will depress your quality is actually not true. Or you take a country like Sweden that used to sort of be the star performer, then lost a lot of ground because some poor policy choices in the late 1900s, and then turning things around. So you can actually fix things. But, the reality is this is just a handful of countries, or 2 handfuls. In most countries, we have seen remarkably little change. And I think that should be the backdrop that should motivate us to do better. Now, let me just highlight one last aspect. You take a country like the Slovak Republic, and you look at the gap that you can see between the wealthiest and the poorest students. And it's dramatic, If you come from a wealthy background, the 10%, most privileged kids, you're doing as well as Estonia or, Canada or Finland. If you come from the poorest decile, you are at the bottom of the scale. So you can see a small country covering the world. And actually, I could have put the United States, very similar picture. And you ask yourself, is that inevitable? Well, again, you look at international comparisons, you look at Portugal, you take students with exactly the same social background, and they come out almost as well as the average performer in the Slovak Republic. And you can take those kids from the 10% most disadvantaged context in the 4 Chinese provinces for which you have data. And you can see they almost match the performance of the top decile by social background in many other countries. So I think that's very, very important to keep in mind that poverty need not be destiny. Actually, if we are consistently attracting the most talented teachers into the most challenging classroom and give every student the opportunities they need, we can actually achieve very, very different results. But, it is not easy. And it is not just a matter of adding time. The first thing that I hear after this pandemic is, oh, we lost so much time, let's make extra hours, let's put, lengthen school days, all of that. That can be part of the answer, but it's certainly not all of the answer. Look at the United Arab Emirates, where students learn already 60 hours per week if you count in-school time and out-of-school time. And you contrast that with Finland on the left side, where this is a little bit more than half of the time only. huge differences in the volume of learning time across countries. But when you look at productivity, now how much do students actually learn per hour of instruction? You can see in Finland, they learn a lot in very little time. Whereas in the UAE, they spend a lot of time and learn comparatively little time. It's not a matter of time. It's a matter of the quality of the learning environment. And learning outcomes are always a product of the quantity and quality of learning time. So the challenge after the pandemic is to change the instructional kind of system. That's really, I think, what we need to talk about. You look at the United States, it's not a shortage of school hours. Actually, schooling hours in the US are well above the OECD average. Also here, it is about, lack of progress per hour of instruction. Very important point we need to keep in mind. You can make the same story with money. Among the OECD countries marked here in blue, you can't really see a very strong relationship between the total volume of money being spent and the quality of an education system. It has a lot to do how we distribute the money. Do we spend our money progressively, ensuring that the children who can benefit most get the best resources, or do we spend it regressively, giving the people who come from wealthy neighborhoods also the better schools? Those things matter a lot more than the volume of spending. It's a different story on the left hand of this slide. When there's little money in the system, money makes a big difference. But again, it's not so simple as just adding time or money to an education system. But I just showed you what doesn't matter. Here's an interesting chart. One of the best predictors that we had for the quality of an education system is actually the mindset of 15-year-olds. You can see, in a country like Estonia, where every 15-year-old has a growth mindset. I can do things. My effort, my investment in learning is going to make a difference. They also do well in this country. You take a country like Indonesia, where students don't do very well on the PISA test, and students all believe, my destiny is fixed. If I'm not born from the right family or with the right genes, then, there's nothing I can do about it. The mindset that we create in young people is a much better determinant on the quality of an education system than simply, time and money. And we can even see where students had a stronger growth mindset, they were more likely to be motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. Once again, think about this pandemic context. If you want your students to be creative, imaginative, they'll have to experiment. If they experiment, they take risks. If they take risks, they make mistakes. If they're afraid of mistakes, probably they're not going to be very creative. Students with a growth mindset also saw more intrinsic value in school. Again, in this pandemic, when students have to learn at home, you're not going to motivate them with extrinsic measures. You have to sort of give them that inspiration, that love to learn that will help them. And again, those things have to do with this. And when we surveyed countries, and this was a survey that Fernando and the OECD did together, you can actually see there's only a very, very small number of education systems that want to go back to where they came from. 22%. You have about 50% of the school systems that actually see their future in integrating the real world and the digital world. Hybrid learning, those kinds of instruments, or out of classroom learning. That commands a very different kind of teaching, a very different kind of learning, if done well. It's not about using technology to conserve existing practice. It's about using technology to transform practice. Now, hybrid learning really is about, building on the strengths of the virtual and the real world. Not dumping technology on kids. It's about, understanding that learning is not a transactional phenomenon, but always a relational phenomenon. Now, that's the aspiration. But then, look at the reality, and let's do a reality check of this. Now, the first thing that you can see is when you look at wealthy kids, technology at home for remote learning looks great. You have close to 100% of students with an internet link at home, or even a place to study, or a computer to do their work. But when you look at disadvantaged schools, the picture looks very, very different. And again, I talk about the wealthiest systems in the world. I'm not talking about countries in disadvantage here. So computer for schoolwork, you get down to, you know, about 80% of kids who do have this. And this huge variation across countries, of course. For example, in the United States, what's really interesting, overall, the gray bar looks good, not close to 90%. But if you come from a disadvantaged background, it's just 3/4. If you come from a wealthy background, everybody has it. So again, and those social disparities become very, very real. If you go here to Indonesia, the Philippines, you know, there are huge kind of social gaps. So easy to say, really, really hard to do. When you look at, you know, digital devices for instruction in school, same picture. Huge variability in how well education systems are prepared for this. The United States sort of looks quite good on this. In fact, I want to credit the United States here for actually making an effort to equip schools in a quite equitable way. In terms of technology, there's much greater equity in United States schools than there is in terms of human resources. But at least that's one aspect. And that brings me to the next aspect. You know, do teachers have the technical and pedagogical skills to integrate technology in instruction? And once again, you can see this huge variability. And again, huge variability between advantage and disadvantage. If you take a disadvantaged school, again, you know, you get close to 50% in a country like the United States. But what's also interesting, you know, those things are not simply, you know, east, west, north, south. You can see the top performer on this are the 4 regions in China. The lowest performer is another high-tech country, Japan. And if you think about Japan, you think about, you know, computers, you know, photo cameras, all of them. And it's all true. But you ask the teachers and the school leaders, and teachers are not ready for the technology-rich world. So this is not just a matter, you know, how advanced your economy is, how many computers you have. This has a lot to do with the kind of vision and idea that we have for our teachers. Huge disparities on this. When you survey schools, you know, in general, I already said schools in the United States are quite well equipped, but look at the red bar here. Very few teachers see themselves as, you know, working in an environment where this is valued, where there are incentives. It's basically, you know, thrown onto schools. They have to do it, but it's not seen as something that, you know, teachers are not part of the design of those solutions. And what we have learned, you know, from our analysis, where you do not involve teachers in the design of pedagogies and practices and technologies, they're not going to help you with implementing them. Very, very important kind of lesson. And, you know, the second challenge is how do we align resources with needs? And we just last week published a fascinating new report on this. And I want to show you some data from this, which I think is really, really interesting. It comes to material resources. What is quite clear is that in the United States, for example, you can say, no, there is no shortage of material resources. The United States is one of the top kind of performers. At least school leaders think, you know, overall things look quite good. But when you actually look at disadvantage, you can see in virtually all countries, there is a much greater shortage of material resources in disadvantaged schools. And on the left side, if you go to Peru, if you go to Colombia, Mexico, Thailand, Brazil, in a wealthy school, things look fine. In a disadvantaged school, you really, really struggle. That's something that's often hidden in the averages. And we can see it makes a difference. Now, we could clearly see where there's a lack of education material, learning outcomes are a lot poorer, where there is inequality or poor quality education material, also physical infrastructure. All of those things were related to learning outcomes. Now, you can say, well, part of this is mediated by social background. You need to take this away. The bars get shorter, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. No, but that's sort of the picture that we see. So the distribution of material resources certainly matters. But let me come to one point that I think is really, really important. You can think about that, you know, more equitable resources will get you more equitable outcomes. And that's, you know, easy to show with PISA, easy to demonstrate across countries. But here's a more interesting picture. You can see actually that a more equitable distribution of resources on the horizontal axis is also positively related to better overall outcomes. So investing in equity is one of your best bets actually to increase the overall learning outcomes. Actually, the mechanics behind it are not so difficult to sort of understand. You know, the biggest learning gains you always achieve among the students, you know, who do not have resources from home. If you have kids from wealthy backgrounds, you're not going to add that much value through school. If you have kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, there's a lot you can do. And that's exactly what this chart shows. But I think it's a very, very important finding that equity is not just about, you know, equity in outcomes, it's also about better outcomes overall. I think a lesson after this pandemic, you know, which has hugely amplified inequalities in our education system, this is a lesson we should take to heart. If we want to address those issues, we'll need to really look into this. Staffing resources, you know, material resources you can quickly produce, quickly distribute if you have money. This is not so easy with staff, with human resources. And there you can actually see, this is where you can see the big kind of inequalities. Remember the United States, you know, they were actually doing quite well in the distribution of material resources. But actually you can see if you are in a disadvantaged school, you have a lot more trouble finding qualified staff. This is something I think that many education systems struggle with. Now, how do you actually make it not just, you know, materially, but also intellectually attractive for great teachers to go into difficult kind of neighborhoods and schools? An area to work on, and once again, you know, this crisis is going to amplify many of the social and economic inequalities that we then see in education. One last point is about learning time. I already highlighted this at the beginning. Now you can see also when you think about something like foreign language learning, that's, you know, about opening your eyes, opening your views to other culture. You know, it's a big asset for many job opportunities, but it's also something that we can see happening more in advantaged schools than disadvantaged schools. Sort of privileged schools have a lot more resources in terms of staffing to provide a richer curriculum and educate more relevant skills. In just a couple of weeks, we're going to launch our first assessment of global competency. You're going to see those pictures here and even more important forms. Well, what do schools actually do? You know, in this pandemic, the kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, they were locked out of their school. How do you bring them back? Well, you know, I don't have the answer what happened after the pandemic, but if you look before the pandemic, it doesn't look very promising. Now, you can basically see on the one hand, schools often make a big effort when they provide facilities. Now you can see basically often in disadvantaged schools, and it's particularly true in the US, students will have a room where they can do their homework. But when it comes to staff providing help with their homework, it looks very different. There you can see really in the OECD area, in most countries, staff will make a particular effort to help struggling students. You can see the red bar in the OECD average goes to the left side. So when it comes staff helping disadvantaged or students with their homework, there is a deliberate effort in the schools to ensure that the disadvantaged students have that extra help. In the United States, the bar goes the other way around. Basically, it's the advantaged schools that provide that extra help. So the people who need it most get the least out of this. Now, how do students deal with this? You can see the picture becomes even more pronounced. You want to learn from your peers? Well, you know, that's rarely happening in a disadvantaged school. It's a lot more likely to happen in a privileged school. But in the United States, again, that gap is much more pronounced. Why do I say this? Because on the areas where things are easy to do, you know, infrastructure, we can do this well. But when it comes to the areas where, you know, it's about human relationships, about, you know, how do we design a structural environment? Peer-to-peer tutoring doesn't cost money. You know, it's a matter of what you do as a teacher, what is important to you, what you do as a school. You know, do you have that kind of idea that students should be working together? There should be a collaborative culture among students. It's not about money, it's about how we actually design the instructional environment. And you can see in disadvantaged schools, those things just don't happen. You know? But When it comes to staff providing help with homework, you can see a lot of effort has been made. And I must actually also say, many countries in the pandemic have, opened school in the summer break for disadvantaged schools, provided extra help. There's lots of things that have happened in this. So, but again, I think we need and can do a lot more on this. I want to highlight something that, particularly people who might be joining us from South America will be interested. Grade repetition is one of the big legacies in education. No? And you can see in some countries, a huge share of young people still repeat school when they don't do well. It's a very convenient thing for teachers to do. You say to yourself, well, I didn't solve that problem. Let, somebody else deal with this next year. It's not my problem, it's the student's problem. Very convenient for schools and teachers. Actually very ineffective for learners. Our data show clearly that it's, very costly. When you add up, the lifetime costs of a grade repeater, you talk about, $20,000, $30,000. It's very ineffective because grade repeaters usually come out more or less the same the year after. Learning the same thing in the same way one more year usually doesn't get you better outcomes. You typically fail because you didn't fail with the kind of school that you were having. So I think we know it's not effective, but it's still very, very common in a number of countries. And it's so interesting. It's an interesting, actually, story of history. It was actually invented in France. They thought, oh, well, we have so many underperformers. Let's deal with this by just, having them repeat a school year. And then, the countries that are very, closely linked to France, like Morocco, like Lebanon, like Luxembourg, like Portugal, like Spain, they imported that idea and did it even more. You can see the bars in those countries still are even longer than in France, actually, because France reduced it in recent years. They were quite successful, actually, in curbing that. But those countries still stuck to that kind of policy. You can see how, and I'm saying this here because sometimes copying and pasting policies from other countries that look better can be a very dangerous thing. But here you can see this is how things happen. And then, you go to Portugal. They exported it to Brazil or, Macau. Because, in the Chinese area, grade repetition has no history. Japan, China, they didn't do those things. If you compare, for example, with mainland China, very few kids repeat a school year. But Macau, because its school system was, oriented towards the Portuguese, they adopted the same kind of policy. Or you look to Spain. They adopted it from France and they spread it to Colombia, to Uruguay, to Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Panama, Peru, Mexico, and all of us Latin America. You can see really how policy ideas have spread, but those countries never asked themselves, was it a good idea or a bad idea? They just said, well, France must be doing this well, or Spain, let's do the same thing. And what the reason, why this is such a troubling number is that our data show that grade repetition is far more common for students from disadvantage. And you can say, well, disadvantaged students are repeating grades more likely because, they have learned less and so on. But look at the blue bar. This is even after accounting for reading performance. Now you take a kid from a wealthy background and a disadvantaged background with exactly the same test score. And you can see the disadvantaged students are still 3 times as likely to repeat the grade than the student from the privileged area. So you can really see this is not about performance. There's a lot of factors at play in this that actually amplify social disparities without leading to better learning results. Big legacy that we need to deal with. And you can see, grade repetition and reading performance are negatively related because it's kind of expensive policy. You can also see it's negatively related to equity. That's also, I think, a very important point that, the systems with a greater share of grade repeaters turn out to be less equitable for the reasons that I already highlighted. I'm going to skip that. I want to sort of conclude with a chapter that I think is also very important. In the times in which we live, we ask ourselves often, how can we make our systems, our school systems more flexible, more responsive to different parent interests, needs, and so on, and at the same time, reconcile this with equity. I think this is one of the hardest questions for public policy. Parents push you to open up more diverse schools and so on. As a country, you want to ensure that students all have the same opportunities. Let's have a look at some data. The first, way you can do this is to have private schools. And you can see in a number of countries, this is a big, big share of the schools. In most countries, actually, I think public is the dominant player. And over the last years, actually, also that has tended to increase. Now, the public has become a more dominant player. It went in different directions. You can see Hong Kong is at one extreme, that people have, run away from public schools or went into, voucher schools. In Korea, is the opposite kind of trend, where you can see this increase in public schooling. So trends are, the mechanisms that work in different countries are very different. But when it comes to sort of learning outcomes, you can see on the surface, you can see private schools doing better. But once you discount for social background, it's actually public schools that have better results. Now, what parents see, of course, is the blue bar. No, the gray triangle. Now, the parents look at the net result that they get. And that's something, makes the private school appear better because of the social context that it has. But when you look at, public policy, you want to maximize your overall learning outcomes. And there you can see actually public schooling is giving you better outcomes, net of social background. Very, very difficult dilemmas between, what you choose for a country and what you might choose for your own children. Selection is another mechanism that you can see, and what we can actually see after accounting for social background, then most selection mechanisms that are being applied at the school level are negatively related to performance. Now, the only exception is if you select students by their academic records. Now, that's obvious. If you filter students by their academic achievement, your average performance is likely increasing, but the average performance of other schools will be decreasing. And that's exactly what you can see in the data. No system-wide gain, only a school-based gain. But most of the other selection mechanisms actually relate negatively to learning outcomes. The earlier you select, now the less equitable your education system. And that's something I think, my own country, Germany, selects students at the age of 10, routing them in, different kind of school tracks. And you can see you pay a big price in terms of larger social inequality. Not surprisingly, the mechanisms are now, I think, quite well understood. You could see, I didn't highlight this, but the United States was a country that says we don't have any tracking. Everybody's in the same school. But actually, the United States is one of the countries with most ability grouping into different classes. So the tracking happens in a more hidden way. And also that is quite similarly negatively related to equity in the education system. You can also do ability grouping within your classes. And there the answer is much more nuanced, actually, where this happens, on a very spontaneous way, subject related. It can be a positive thing, can be positively related to outcomes. Where it happens across all subjects, typically it's something that relates more negatively to outcomes. And we still have to unpack those findings. I must say we are just scratching the surface, but we can't really say that ability grouping in a class is a negative thing, actually. There seem to be sort of different kind of trends going on. For example, when you do it for all subjects, you can see there's a negatively cross-country relationship, but when you do it for some subjects, sort of selectively, more dynamically, you can see many high-performing education systems adopt those kinds of policies and practices. So I think something worth further to study. Very last point is about evaluation and assessment. Most education systems now collect data on student outcomes. Very different from 20 years ago when this was a novel phenomenon. But in the United States, it's a country where this is mandatory. In many countries, it's more on the school's own initiative, but the result is quite similar. The way in which the orange and the blue charts are divided up varies a lot across countries, but you can see if you add it up, you get quite similar results. Very few countries where that evaluation culture is not yet well established. No? Posting achievement data publicly, once you have collected this data, what do you do with this? No? United States, number one, it's all going to be posted publicly. Well, if you go to Finland or Belgium, you'd never do that, no? Except for some few private schools. No? So very, very different cultures in the way in which school-based information on outcomes is actually used. In some countries, the stakes are high for students. In some countries, the stakes are high for teachers. No? Those cultures vary a lot. We've done some very interesting analysis on this. Now, the United States does a lot of collection of outcome data, but it actually is not among the countries which survey students a lot. If you go to the left side, for example, China, New Zealand, Qatar, they are regularly seeking feedback from students in many different forms. If you go to France, where I live, it's happened very well. In the United States also, it's among the countries where student voice is the one less listened to. And probably that's something we should rethink after this pandemic. I think the learner experience, how did learners actually, experience the learning process is something probably we can learn a lot from the voice of students. That's all I wanted to share with you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Why don't you guys raise your hand using the participants function, and then maybe Andreas can take like 3 questions at a time and then answer. Manar.
Yes, thank you for this insightful presentation. I was wondering if PISA as an assessment tool takes into consideration the issues of diglossia in Arab-speaking countries, especially that most of the governments there, I'm Egyptian, and I know that the language purity is something that most Arab-speaking countries, if not all, takes highly, and it's a very sensitive topic. And I do think that this impacts the teaching and the literacy levels, especially for younger students and also for like middle schoolers. So the 2 levels of the language, the spoken, the everyday life language for students is different than the language they read in texts. So I was just wondering how, or is there any recommendations to tackle this issue? Or yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Manar. Let's take 2 more. Aruj.
Thank you for your presentation and the brilliant visualizations. I noticed that a number of the charts showed that data was self-reported by principals. So I was wondering, how do you create samples within countries? Are they random? Are they not? And then what challenges do you face when principals or other actors are self-reporting rather than being evaluated from perhaps an external source that may be trusted as more unbiased?
Thank you, Renata.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation. So a lot of focus right now is really on learning loss and avoiding it. I'm wondering if you could also speak to the question of what are the major educational opportunities that you see coming out of the post-COVID period, and perhaps how can we as graduate students participate in making sure that those opportunities are enacted? Thank you.
Great. Over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, very good questions. On the first one, you're absolutely right. The language with which we confront students in the test, the written Arab, is often very different from the spoken language. And the further the gap, this is making a difference. It's not just affecting the Arab countries. In fact, I think this is an issue that we have in a fair number of countries. And in some of the Arab countries, actually, it's even more extreme. Like some actually teach science in English because they have found that actually it's very hard to teach science in Arab. And so the language gap becomes even further. So yeah, this is a real, I think, issue, but it's not just an issue in the PISA test, it's an issue in life. If you move into a job, you're going to face that same written language. So I think that is a big dilemma that countries need to resolve, and that you can see in the PISA results. The way we actually address this is by collecting data on the spoken language at home. So we actually know what language students speak at home, and then you can actually see what effect that has on their performance. You can basically discount that effect from the test scores. Arush asked sort of two questions. One is, do we have random samples? And the answer is clearly yes. The schools are selected at random, they are representative. But the self-reporting issue is a different story. And many of our indicators are self-reported. And in fact, we're often very interested in this, in the principal's perception. Like we have data, for example, on student-staff ratios. We know how many teachers there are in a school. But we are still interested whether the principal perceives there to be a shortage, and sometimes the perception, the perceived reality can matter more than the actual reality. We also deal with this by looking at this from multiple perspectives. For example, we ask principals about discipline in a classroom, and we ask students the very same questions. And sometimes the answers match perfectly. And then you can see actually there's probably a school climate that is very open, transparent, and everybody talks. Sometimes the principal's story is very different from what students tell you. And usually students tell you the truth, so they don't have any incentives to sort of distort the picture. And it might tell you, the principals are quite disconnected actually from the learning climate. So we're very interested in that perception aspect, even where we do have good data. And triangulation is our main means. We survey students, teachers, parents, and teachers, and then sort of put the picture together. The point on learning loss, I really like that point, the opportunity part. And I think the biggest opportunity for educators is actually to look at the things not that were lost, but that were learned, that were not learned previously. Now, I think many students are going to go back to their teachers and say, well, actually, I learned to set my own learning goals. I discovered learning, in many different ways. Why don't we do that more in classroom? I think the greater importance of social emotional skills, that used to be a marginal topic in public policy. Now you can see virtually every country is realizing actually, these, whether it's curiosity, courage, leadership, empathy, those skills matter so fundamentally. In the past, you could basically assume, if you talk to your students, they listen to you. Now, in a kind of remote environment, you have to engage them. You have to motivate students. You have to understand how different students learn differently. And then you have to focus on student agency and teacher agency rather than treating, students as passive consumers. So I do think that shift in mindset, in understanding, that shift from just cognitive skills to a much broader range of cognitive, social, and emotional resources, I think is a very, very interesting one that I expect will translate into curriculum design in many countries. I think we have learned so much about how students learn and teachers learn and parents learn that I'm quite optimistic that we're going to see some effects.
Great. Let's hear from you now. Let's take another round of questions. Crystal.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you so much, Andreas. I'm always very inspired when I hear you speak. So thank you so much for spending the time to talk with us. In 2016, I was privileged to talk at the Finland's launch of the Global Monitoring Report. And after I spoke, someone from the ministry came up to me and said, you education people, you think that education can solve everything, but education is so intimately tied with the economy and with healthcare and all of the other systems in society. So my question for you is, what is your position and what is OECD's position about the kinds of social policies that are needed to mitigate the economic inequality that we see impact student performance? So thanks so much.
Thank you, Crystal. Do we have other questions? Raise your hand. If not, oh, there it is, Austin.
I always have a question, so.
Good.
John Hattie, who wrote the book Visible Learning, which does all the meta-analysis, in April, he published a piece where he said, if you look at the Christchurch earthquakes in 2011, there actually wasn't as much learning loss as one might expect because teachers were forced to adapt and understand what students were actually learning, as opposed to marching through kind of a preset program, which they were used to. I'm wondering if you buy that argument and if you think there's kind of a limit given that that was a much shorter time than we're experiencing now.
Thank you. Let's see if we have a third question before Andreas takes them on. There it is, Marianne.
Hi, everyone. I just had a quick question related to research and gathering data. I'm curious to know for the OECD, because of COVID, have there been any difficulties or setbacks and being able to collect data the way that you used to? Or have there actually been any advantages in any way to getting data now? I'm just curious to know how that's been going for the OECD. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, on the first question, I'm in two minds about it. On the one hand, I agree, education has always been and is always a whole of society project. It has so many dimensions that you need to get to work together. But, I think often we take it as an excuse. Oh, well, society is very unequitable, therefore education can't solve that. And what you can see, and I think this one of the most fascinating findings from PISA is that you take countries with a similar level of social inequality, and the equity in education can be hugely, hugely different. And that makes me very optimistic that education can actually make a massive difference. If you look to countries like Vietnam, income inequality in Vietnam is huge. And still, the education system is very carefully designed to align resources with needs. Many of the village schools are of the highest quality. And China, very similar kind of picture. So actually, I do think the Nordic countries in Europe are perhaps not such a good example, because there you have a much more kind of homogeneous environment. But I actually think, yeah, it's a chicken and egg issue. I think we on the one hand, we need to recognize the interrelationships of, and this is what good schools are about. I think the school in Finland is a great example where actually all social services are integrated in the education function. But I think there is a lot of a difference that education can make on that relationship between social background and learning outcomes. The question from Austin on learning losses, yeah, some people say, people are going to catch up very quickly, but the initial data that we have is very, very different. Disparities have hugely increased. Yeah, there are student groups. I have data from from Belgium, from Germany, where actually, learning losses has been limited. Usually students, have been well supported at home with access to great technology, but there are ones where the learning losses are simply huge. They're actually larger than what you expect. It's not just, 3-4 months that were lost, but the learning losses are even further. So that means that students have fallen back from what they already knew. So I think that's a real issue. I don't think, I know many people say, oh, it's all going to go away. People have survived wars and everything, and some have found their way back. But I think this learning loss is going to remain and be real, at least from the data that we have, the initial data that we have on test performance. There may be also learning gains. I think I don't want to deny this. I'm sure students have learned different things that they didn't learn before. And I think we need to capture that in some ways and not, discard it or not measure it. I think that's very important. But I think we need to take this learning loss issue very, very serious, particularly for the most disadvantaged groups, because they are not going to see, one thing that you can see consistently over time is that our education systems are not very good at moderating social inequality. They typically reinforce social inequality. So anybody saying, oh, this is going to go away, there's not much evidence from the past in this. On the last question on difficulties collecting data, so far not. I think we have our data systems are pretty robust. We have postponed the PISA test by 1 year, just to sort of because otherwise we would have had very distorted samples. The part that worries me more is that I see very little interest among policymakers actually to study the effects of the pandemic. This is the moment where we should treat this as a giant experiment and actually collect the kind of data that will help us understand what happened in this crisis. If we don't do that, 10 years from now, we've all forgotten, and we will not learn from this crisis. And I don't see a lot of interest and a lot of resources going into new types of research to study the effect of the pandemic.
Very good. Let's get a couple more questions. Suri.
Hi, thank you very much. So my question is regarding what instruments you found to be most effective at measuring things like soft skills, so grit, resiliency, empathy, and such.
Great. Let's get a couple more. Josue.
Yeah, thank you. This goes a little bit aligned with what Siri just asked. Considering the difficulty of measuring and monitoring the teaching and learning of soft skills and all this intelligences that we are usually pretty bad already at measuring and teaching, how can we ensure, or is the OECD doing something to ensure that there is better instruments so that we can have a more accurate diagnosis of the effect of COVID on this type of learning?
Thank you. Armando.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas, for your presentation. And I wonder, where do you need, if that's the case, where do you think more disruption will be needed? The school as we know it, and the school systems as we know it, they will change because of these issues that we're dealing with. But where do you think more disruption will be needed? Where the change needs to be more deep? Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Over to you.
Yeah, on the question of soft skills, first of all, I really don't like this term. I actually think in the post-pandemic time, soft skills are going to be the new hard skills, and many of the hard skills will turn out to be very soft. I'm a physics graduate, and I did a great job when I had my first job in industry. If you put me in a laboratory today, I'm going to do a miserable job because the field of physics has changed fundamentally. Most of what I learned has no value anymore. It's a very soft skill. Actually, when you think about, empathy, when you think about character, resilience, these, in the time in which we live, are the new kind of skills of the future. Can you work with people who think differently from you, who are differently from you? Those are the hard skills of the next kind of time in which we work. And I do think it's very, very important that we measure them well, because we're not going to improve or change what we can't see. And I think that's the big problem of those kinds of skills. It's not so much a matter of instrumentation. Actually, I think we have quite good instruments to assess them directly. Actually, when I started working on this in the OECD, I had someone telling me, well, if you can show me that you can measure empathy for a 5-year-old child, I will fund your whole project on social emotional skills. And basically the premise was, that's totally impossible. Well, actually, just in January this year, we published our first direct assessment of empathy of 5-year-old children, actually. And it was not that difficult. You read to young children a story and you can see how they react to different characters. And you can score and scale that in the same way as you score math and science. Actually, I think we have very well advanced. Technology is extremely powerful. In 2015, we assessed collaborative problem solving skills. Not how well are you in solving your own problems, but how well can you actually share, jointly develop solutions with other people around you. And it was actually not a very difficult thing technically to do. The bigger issue was one that when we published those results, many teachers came to us and said, oh, so interesting, but it has nothing to do with what I do. I'm not supposed to do those kinds of things. It's not part of the curriculum. So it was seen as something extraneous to the education system rather than something at the core of it. Same reaction from policymakers. In fact, we had a whole range of countries who from the start said, we're not going to do this test because that's not what the intention of the education system is about. That's where the bigger problem is. The measurement, I think, has hugely improved. Technology is very, very good at tracking, your emotions. You can have so many different kind of data sources that you can interlink. That I think the measurement problem, I think, is pretty well solved. The more difficult question that we have today is how do we interpret this data and how we actually build them meaningfully into the classroom and school environments. The most for a scientist, the most difficult aspect is that, for mathematics and science, it's easy. The higher your score, the better you are. No? That's we know how to interpret those things. For social emotional skills, it's not so obvious. You want people to be persistent, but you don't want them to be stubborn. No? So what is the optimal configuration and what context of those social emotional skills? I think that is where the real problem lies. But I see very little effort. Usually when you have a national curriculum, there's a beautiful preamble that highlights, we are in favor of a holistic student development with all this cognitive, social, emotional development. And you find very, very little when it comes to the heart of the curriculum. That's where we need to work. And then the measurement, I think, is easy to do. And that brings me also to the disruption element. I think we have seen a lot of disruption in the how, in the methods of education. The pandemic is a great example. Systems suddenly, certain approaches collapse completely and we need to reinvent them. But we have seen remarkably little disruption in the what question. That's basically where, why do we teach trigonometry? You've all gone through this in your schools. We've all learned those things. And, when I worked on the first PISA test, we ask ourselves, what should we test? And then, everybody says you have to do a task for 15-year-olds of trigonometry. That's what they learn in those ages. And then we went out, to ask the mathematicians and say, why is trigonometry so important? And they were telling us, trigonometry? Well, that's a very specific application of mathematics, but it has nothing to do with the ways of mathematical thinking and reasoning. It's not part of the foundations of mathematics. Then you went out to ask the engineers and say, well, why do you teach so much? Why do we need to have this trigonometry? And they say, trigonometry? Well, our computers do all of that. That's not relevant. And you want to know the answer why we teach this? Because 300-400 years ago, those kind of skills were needed to measure the size of our fields and design our houses. And this legacy has become an inert way of, we transport it from generation to generation. Or we teach, somebody says, Latin is important because it strengthens logical thinking. Someone has, come to that conclusion and we just take it on from year to year. So disruption on the how, we've seen plenty, but we see very, very little disruption. And what is it going to take to educate young people for their future rather than just our past?
Charlotte, you get to ask the last question.
That was so beautifully said. Thank you, Fernando. That was so beautifully said, Andreas. I can really just listen to you all day. I want to hear your opinion about why hasn't your work, the work of the OECD, led to meaningful change in the United States when it comes to equity? You pinpoint very clear what the issues are, and there are very intelligent people leading education in this country. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, why do we continue to see the same problems and issues generation after generation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I actually, I worked very closely over the years with Arne Duncan, and he took on many things in education policy, that were about reform and education. But this was an issue. He said, if I touch that point, the distribution of school resources and things like this, I will have everybody against me. Nobody's going to change tax policies and income generation and all of those kinds of things. So the level of political will for change on equity is just very low. But that's only one aspect. I think the deeper aspect, in my view, is that, what you need, if you want to change an education system, you need to have an education system and not just, 10,000 individual schools. And I think that's really lacking in the United States. You have a high level of, local autonomy at the districts in managing, the education system. But you don't have a lot of frontline capacity. When we look at the PISA indicators, the United States ranks in the lower third of countries when it comes to empowerment, the kind of frontline capacity that you have to design an environment. And then you have nothing at the central level either. There is a very little kind of steering at the state or the system level. Again, something, which has always impressed me. You go to, a state district office, and you meet the secretary there, and you'll find maybe, 5-10 people working on systemic issues. It's very little, I think, system capacity, very little frontline capacity, and that makes it very, very hard to change a system, even if you want to. That's my reading of that. It's not that people don't know the data, that they don't read the reports. I think, we had many, many conversations with them. I really feel that there is insufficient capacity at the system level and at the front line to actually affect change. Completely apart from this bigger question of, are you willing to, change the distribution of resources? The political economy is very, very difficult in those kinds of questions. The winners and losers, are difficult to deal with. The asymmetries and the benefits and the cost, that's a totally different story. But I think the first issue to solve is really to strengthen the system capacity.
Andreas, this has been wonderful. Do you want to make any closing remarks?
No, I've really enjoyed it. I think your questions are up to the point. No, I couldn't, I could only give you sort of indications. I think they deserve, each of your questions really deserves a lot of further discussion. And I really think this is a fantastic conference. Thank you for letting me.
Andreas, thank you so very much for being with us and for what you do. Please join me in thanking Andreas for a great keynote. That was terrific.
Thank you very much.